Hey YouTube, we're going to start on chapter 11, the ghost and the solemn warning. Again, 5 years had elapsed. Nahum and Hermon had witnessed the birth of many grandchildren, and the teachings and warnings of old Ezra had long been forgotten. The Israelites had now become so hardened in inequity that not a single vestige of their former religion was to be found among them. Every house in New Samaria had its images and idols before whom the inhabitants burned incense and sacrificed the blood of their own children. The temple had been changed from the house of Hiah to the temple of Moloch, and the latter was served by 20 priests whose licentiousness beggared all description. In short, New Samaria had become an abode of vice. It was a lovely morning in the month of June, and the city was decked out with all the pomp of a heathenish festival. And that's the picture. That day the image of Moloch was to be born through the principal streets of New Samaria in solemn procession. That day was set apart for the great sacrifice. A virgin whose person had not been polluted by the touch of a man was to be dedicated to the idol. Abominable mockery. Very few there were among the maidens of the city who had remained pure amid all the bad examples, all the licentiousness that surrounded them. But those few were among the bravest and the best, and they were therefore chosen by the accursed priests of Moloch to minister to their own infernal lust, to their own beastly desires. It was to be decided by lot drawn by the priests themselves, which of the poor girls that had been branded as pure was to be the victim. I say that had been branded as pure, for in those days it was regarded a crime for a maiden to be chaste after reaching the 15th year, and so severe were the heathenish statutes made and most rigorously enforced by the priests that the king himself would not have dared to even murmur if one of his own children had been selected for the sacrifice. And now the doors of the temple were thrown open, and preceded by a band of music, the 20 priests of Moloch emerged into the street, clad in their gaudy robes of office. After them came 25 young girls dressed in red skirts, while their bosoms down to the waist were left naked. Long hair, black and glossy as the raven's wing, fell in numerous ringlets down on their snowy shoulders, while in their hands they bore wreaths and bunches of rare flowers. Then followed a closed carriage drawn by 12 youths, whose dress consisted of a pair of short scarlet pantaloons, the other part of their body being left naked, like the bosoms of the girls preceding them. Within the carriage, dressed in white, and their faces covered with thick veils, were seated 6 young girls whose ages varied from 16 to 18 years, and who were the only ones to be found in New Samaria deserving the appellation of virgin. And as a reward for this, and as a reward for the constancy and the fortitude with which they had withstood all temptations, they were now being born to the sacrifice. One of their number was destined to become the property of the most licentious rascals in all the city, to become the slave, the victim, who, though ostensibly a sacrifice to the heathen deity, in reality was to minister to the beastly lust of the accursed priests, and who, after their devilish desires were satiated, was doomed to perish by the most miserable of all deaths, that of starvation. Following the carriage came the king and the queen, accompanied by Hiram and Tamar, and followed by the officers of the royal household, all of whom wore their uniforms of state. Next were the young men and women attired in the most shameless manner, and at last came the aged and feeble, closing the procession. It was a disgusting sight to behold how the latter tried in manner and dress to imitate the levity and wantonness of their sons and daughters. Nahum the king and Hermon his queen were clad in their royal robes, but their faces were sad and desponding looks. In the wagon before them, among the 6 maidens, one of whom was to be the victim, sat Ch.11, the best beloved child, their heart's idol, and a dark presentiment had already told them that she of all was destined for the sacrifice. In vain had the king exerted all the influence of his high station to ward off the blow from the head of his devoted darling. But alas, he himself had led his people in the way of heathens, and now, according to the custom of all the heathenish nations, the priests of their first deity had become all-powerful with the inhabitants of New Samaria. Hermon had humbled herself in the dust. She had fallen on her knees before the high priest of Moloch to implore his mercy. Vain, that hoary-headed libertine knew that he should be the first to possess the poor victim. And Tamai, was so beautiful. All at last, both parents saw that all earthly hope was gone, and in despair they even turned their eyes heavenward. They implored the help of their God. They implored the help of the God of their forefathers. They vowed to return from their evil ways. But how could they expect that offended Haya would listen to their prayers? And now they began the beginning of the end. And now they beheld the beginning of the end. They had seen their beloved daughter forced out of their midst by rude hands. They had seen her led, or rather dragged, to the temple. They had seen her thrust into the carriage with her unfortunate companions, and now they saw her borne on her final doom. But to return to the procession, with measured steps, the priests of Moloch bearing the image of the idol in their midst, and their followers strode up the principal street of New Samaria on the first altar that had been erected in front of the royal palace. Here the image was set down, and the priests formed a semicircle. Then the 25 half-naked girls mentioned above, and whose bore the then proud title of daughters of Moloch, stepped forward, and while the music struck up a half-wind, half-solemn strain, they began to dance around the idol. At first their steps were slow and measured, but the music grew wilder, and the movements of the girls became quicker, while their bodies were contorted in the most vulgar and indelicate manner. But wilder and wilder the music sounded, quicker and quicker grew the vulgar dance, until at last this and the contortions of their bodies were frightful to behold. After a while the maidens could hold out no longer, and one after another they fell down in utter exhaustion. Then the carriage was drawn forward. The doors were thrown open, and the 6 virgins were forced to alight. They were led to the image, and there compelled to throw themselves flat on their faces. While they were in that posture, a young man who had acted as a coachman, and who, with the exception of a flame-colored sash tied around his loins, was entirely naked, sprang from his seat and came forward. "Mighty God of this great and glorious nation," he said, "in these maidens who now lie prostrate at thy feet, thou beholdest those who have been deemed worthy to be sacrificed on thy altar. Before long, the lot would have decided which of them will be chosen by the great Moloch for his own. Guide the hands of thy holy priests when the lots are drawn, that she who is the purest and best may indeed be selected." All the girls now arose. The 6 virgins were made to kneel around the image, and then the 12 youths, led only by him who had acted as a spokesman, came forward. The band again began to play, but the strain had lost its half solemnity, and now it burst forth in unbounded wildness. The daughters of Moloch, who by this time had entirely recovered from their exhaustion, joined the young men, and now began one of those wanton and bacchanalian dances which, fortunately, Christianity and civilization have banished forever, unless indeed they should yet exist in some of the lowest dens of inequity of our own days. Soon the excitement of the dancers infected the rest of the multitude. First the young men and women, and finally even the old and feeble, rushed forth to join in the shameless orgies. The king and his queen had hitherto preserved their dignity. The anxiety for their beloved child which gnawed on their hearts had made them insensible to all that surrounded them, and following their example, their companions had also remained quiet. But now the general excitement exerted its influence even here, and forgetting all else, Nahum, Hermon, Harim, Tamar, and their followers joined in the wild dance. A piercing shriek went up from under the veil that hid the pale but lovely features of Tamar, who, like her unfortunate companions, was forced to look upon that disgusting spectacle when she saw her father and mother, old and feeble though they had grown, rush forth in mad excitement. The king's daughter and her 5 virgin friends had been among the pupils of good old Ezra, and his teachings had produced the desired result in the pure hearts of the 6 children. Gladly would that faithful priest have taken his darlings out of a city whose inhabitants he saw would sink deeper and deeper until some fearful and final doom should terminate their existence. But they were too young then to be taken away without the consent of their parents, and that of course was not to be obtained. Yet the hearts of the girls were stronger, and his teachings had taken deeper root than Ezra had hoped. And despite all of the licentiousness of their friends and neighbors, they had preserved their purity. And this had not been all the consequences of the good old man's admonitions. There were in New Samaria 2 young men who also had been among the disciples of Ezra, and who also had been steadfast enough to preserve their hearts pure. Omar, son of Nahum, a young man 21 years old, 21 years was exact counterpart of what his father had been when I first introduced him to my readers. The strength of his frame was of course not so well developed as that of his sire at the time I speak of, yet the cut and the features was the same, while his appearance in general justified the belief that with the coming years the son would grow even stronger than the father. Omar's friend and companion Gad was the son of Korah, one of the higher officers of the king's household. He was now 25 years old, and he too like the majority of his countrymen at the time, was a young man of a stately form and with regular and well-cut features. These two young men did not share in the idolatry and licentiousness of their neighbors. They had not joined the vulgar procession of the day, but had met at the house of old Isaac, a firm friend and adherent of Ezra, but whose age and infirmities had not allowed him to accompany that good man on his emigration. And as for the present priests of Moloch did not covet the possession of the two friends, they had been allowed to do as they liked. Meanwhile, the vulgar dance around the image in front of the king's palace had reached its own climax, and the dancers began to sink down one after another in sheer exhaustion. The 6 virgins, although compared to look upon that most disgusting spectacle, had thus far been permitted to retain their thick veils, and this they regarded as a great blessing, for thus the blushes that suffused their faces at the sight of the indecent contortions and exposures were hidden from the libertine gaze of the gaping crowd. But now the priests rushed forward, half mad with passion, like so many demons. They stood around the trembling maidens with their rude hands, tore off the protecting veils to glut their bloodshot eyes in the charms of their victims. The extreme and commanding beauty of Ch.11, who had just finished her 16th year, and whose graceful, well-rounded, and faultless form towered high over her companions, kindled in a fire in the breast of that hoary-headed high priest, whose hair and beard had been whitened by more than 50 winters of such intensity that he mentally swore to possess the king's daughter, cost what it might, and from that moment the doom of the poor girl was sealed. But this was not all. The sight of so many handsome faces, their beauty heightened by the blushes that overspread them on so suddenly and unexpectedly becoming exposed to the gaze of men, had completely maddened the licentious priest, and it was forthwith resolved that one victim would not be sufficient to satisfy the cravings of their passion, and that at least 2 of them should be demanded. Ada, the daughter of Aaron, another high officer in the king's household, was in her 18th year. She had been brought up with Talmai, and the similarity of their characters and inclinations had made the 2 girls fast friends. Ada was not tall as her friend, nor was her beauty so intense and commanding. Still, she was very handsome, and the faultless cut of her features was of that style that appeals directly to the senses. After Talmai, she was the handsomest of the 6 virgins, and therefore when the priest resolved to demand 2 victims instead of 1, her doom also was sealed. And now the veils of the virgins were readjusted for the multitude, who in their excitement had danced and jumped until their senses reeled, and who therefore had seen nothing of the doings of the priests, began to recover from their exhaustion. When all had been restored to consciousness, the priests came forward and in solemn mockery threw themselves down before the altar in pretended prayer. After a little while there arose an ascending a platform that had been erected on one side of the altar. The high priest said, "Sons and daughters of Moloch, we have once more met to perform that solemn duty which we owe to our mighty God. My heart bleeds, and these tears that I am not ashamed to shed are witnesses to the sincerity of my grief, but duty compels me to stifle the emotions out of my heart. These virgins who have been found worthy to become a sacrifice to the great Moloch are themselves the cause of their present affliction. They have lived so that they have become unworthy to live among us, and therefore our merciful God has chosen them for his own, as he in his greatness would disdain to possess what man had enjoyed before him. But whatever else may have been the conduct of these maidens, they are daughters and have never been remiss in their filial duties, and it is in behalf of their afflicted parents that my heart bleeds, that these tears are shed. Oh, my brethren and sisters, my sons and daughters, it is hard to be the performer of so a great sacrifice, but my office demands it, and the good Moloch will strengthen my feeble arm, blind my tearful eyes, and still my bleeding heart in the execution of my work. As I did 5 years ago, so shall I today spare you the sight of the bloody spectacle. And when you hear the solemn tolling of the bell on yonder temple, know that the sacrifice will have been performed." Here the speaker ceased to observe the effect of his words had produced on his hearers. He knew that he must proceed with the utmost caution, for although the inhabitants of New Samaria had completely turned from the God of their forefathers, and adopted the statutes of the heathens, they had stood aghast when 5 years before, just after the departure of Ezra and his followers, the priests of Moloch had proposed the cold-blooded murder of a grown maiden as a sacrifice to the idol, and all their arts and persuasions had hardly enabled them to obtain the consent of the people. Fortunately for them, their first victim had been a poor, unprotected creature without parents or friends, but the plan they had formed in their unholy passion to have the thing repeated every year, they dared not to bring into execution, and therefore, after the minds of the populace were thoroughly sounded, it had been determined that the great sacrifice should be performed every 5 years. The wily priests were well aware that they must not proceed too hastily to gain their end, but bide their time, and while they congratulated themselves on having obtained the consent of the people to the first step in the desired direction, they had no doubt that in time they should be able to lead them at will, to have an object wherewith to satisfy their beastly desires. During the intervening space of 5 years, they had put their first victim into a lofty, well-aired underground apartment constructed by themselves for that purpose, and while they had partaken but sparingly of the fruit in their passion, they had done all in their power to preserve the charms of the poor girl. But now she was to be cast aside, and already on the day preceding the procession had she been thrust into a dark and gloomy hole, also constructed by the priests for that purpose, in the bowels of the earth, and there they had left her without food or drink. But at the same time, the villains had not been idle in other directions. They had worked hard to fortify and strengthen their power, and now the minds of their followers were pretty well prepared to listen to any atrocity that might be proposed and advocated by them. Yet the proposition they were to make on that day was a startling one, when even to themselves, to obtain possession of Tamai, the king's daughter, they thought they could manage well enough. On that score they had no fears, but how to gain the consent of the people to do that proposition, to have 2 victims instead of 1, was another question, and even the hardened and rascally priests trembled when they thought of the possible consequences. Yet their hearts were set on gaining their object, and they had resolved to try it, at all events come what might. And therefore, when he had been silent long enough to observe the effects of his words, and when he had seen that the eyes of his hearers were directed to him, and that the latter regarded him with respect and veneration for the tender feelings of his heart, so cleverly depicted in his hypocritical words, the high priest continued, "But my dearly beloved friends, Moloch is dissatisfied. The smell of our last sacrifice has long since evaporated. The nostrils of our God have become parched, and they have expanded like unto the boundaries of our city. When last night I lay on my hard pillow thinking of my duties and of the prosperity of our people, the mighty prince of unbounded regions appeared to me in his wrath. Fire and brimstone came out of his mouth that was terrible to behold, and in tones of thunder he threatened to sweep us and our city from the face of the earth if his wrath were not appeased. Then I took courage, even I, humble and unworthy, though I felt in that presence, I expostulated, but he soon silenced me. Sacrifice, he thundered forth. Call ye a feeble maiden, burnt on my altar at intervals of 5 years, a sacrifice to such as I. The smell of 100 burning cities like yours would hardly fill the 10th part of my nostrils, and yet I forbear. But if tomorrow's sun does not see my wrath appeased, tremble, for no longer will I spare you." He then was silent, and I was unable to speak to him. I spoke of our late errors and how we had only recently become converted, of our growing attachment to the true faith and our willingness to serve him, and at last I succeeded in calming him to such an extent that he promised not to withdraw from us as his protection if on this occasion we would sacrifice 2 virgins instead of 1, and repeat the sacrifice every 12 months. Then he disappeared. "And now, my beloved brethren and sisters, my sons and daughters," concluded the speaker, "I have told you what is expected of us and what we may expect in return. And if you ask my advice, it is we will comply with the request of our great Moloch." The sermon was ended, and the high priest looked around upon his hearers, but they were silent. Horror had bound their tongues. The words of the preacher had been so powerful. The horror depicted in his face had been so well feigned that not one in the vast assembly, with the exception of the 6 virgins who had not once looked up to the speaker, doubted the sincerity of his assertions. The poor victims had heard and understood every word uttered by that hoary hypocrite, and their souls had been filled with grief and despair, for not only had their chances of escaping from the fearful doom become much smaller, but they were certain now to be sacrificed at last. Only the priests rejoiced. They had gained the victory, for they saw the looks of the people that no objection would be made on that side, and it required all the efforts of their hardened nature to preserve their wonted dignity and decorum. It took some time before the multitude recovered from the effect produced by the speech of the high priest, and when at length all had become tranquil, that old villain again alluded to the subject and said, "If no objection is raised among you, I shall consider it my duty to make the sacrifice a double one. But if, on the other hand, any one of your midst be dissatisfied with that, let him come forward And then let me tell you that I have done in all my power to make you follow the right course. And if after all my advice should not be heeded, then beware how you provoke the anger of our God, and on your own heads be the consequences. But no objection was raised, and so the affair was settled to the intensest satisfaction of the priest. The procession now again formed. The 6 virgins were put back into the carriage, and in the order in which they had come, the multitude resumed their march to the next altar. Here they went through the same ceremonies that had been performed at the first stopping place, the sermon only being dispensed with, and so the procession moved through the entire city, stopping at 12 different places where similar altars had been erected, and before each which at the same vulgar and bacchanalian orgies were repeated. At last, 2 hours after noon, the procession returned to the temple, where the people were dismissed to rest and refresh themselves, and to reassemble at the 4th hour, when the lots were to be drawn, and when the victims were to take their last farewell of parents, friends, and the world in general. The wagon was drawn into the temple, where it was to be left and watched over by the priests, while the virgins were to remain as guests of Moloch until that great and divine personage should have indicated through the lot in the hands of his priests which of the maidens were worthy to be sacrificed. Nahum and Hermon had to be carried home for the exertions of the day, and their anguish in behalf of their best beloved child, whom they now felt no earthly power could save, had been too much for them, and in a state of utter prostration, they arrived at the royal palace. Our two friends, Omar and Gad, had meantime not left the dwelling of old Isaac, and all three were engaged in an earnest conversation when the door was unceremoniously opened, and in strolled a young man about 26 years old, whom they instantly recognized as Abner, old Isaac's son, and in whom we too find a recent acquaintance, to wit, the young man in the flame-colored sash who had acted as coachman in the great procession. But now he was not naked. He wore the costume of the young men of his class in fashion, which he had also worn when he went to the temple that morning. Abner had not a bad heart, but he was naturally wild and reckless. A proper and judicious education would in all probability have made a good and true man of him, but unfortunately he had been the only son of his father, and his mother had died when he had scarcely been born. Old Isaac had loved his wife with a sincerity rarely equaled even in our days of Christianity, and when the cherished partner of his life had died, he had transferred all his love to her firstborn. And so Abner had been spoiled by indulgence. At first he had joined his fellow citizens in their heathenish ceremonies out of idle curiosity, but little by little he had become pleased with the wild and licentious life, and now he was a firm adherent of Moloch and the teachings of that idol's priest. Yet he loved his father with a sincerity that amounted to veneration, and on no account would he have done an act to that he knew would seriously displease the old man. Had Isaac been firm and seriously remonstrated with his son, he could have easily have led him back to the true faith, but the father was too weak. Therefore the son sank deeper and deeper. When the young man had effectually When the young man had affectuously embraced his father and cordially greeted Omar and Gad, both of whom he well knew and much respected, he sat down and related what he had seen at the procession. The cheeks of the two friends flushed when they heard that even their old parents had taken part in the shameless dance, but they were silent, and Abner, who had not perceived the change in their countenance, went on. Although he said the lots are not drawn yet, I can pretty well guess which of the 6 virgins are to be sacrificed. For as I must inform you, we are this time to have 2 victims instead of 1, as the great Moloch appeared to his high priest last night and threatened to sweep us and our lovely city from the face of the earth if at least 2 maidens were not burned on his altar. The priest supposed that nobody knows who will really be sacrificed, and they even pretend to know that nothing themselves. But I have had my ears and eyes open, and when they believe me absent or asleep, I can tell you that they will manage the drawing of the lots as it pleases themselves. I pity the poor girls, but then the priests say it must be done, and so I think it can't be helped. Our friends shuddered when they heard what the young man said, yet they did not feel surprised, for too well they knew that the priests of Moloch had it all their own way in New Samaria, which name, by the way, had now been changed to New Babylon, and that no power in the city was strong enough to oppose their wishes. Omar and Gad had also all along thought that the villainous priests must have had some hidden object of their own in proposing the sacrifice, and they had long wondered why the latter had not been demanded more victims. Hey YouTube, we're just finishing up chapter 10. Demanded more victims from the first, but that the drawing of the lots was managed as the priest pleased. The 2 young men had never doubted, and now they wished to know which of the virgins would be the victims, and so they asked their informant if he would tell them. When that young man with his useful frankness said, "Mark me, if Tamar, the king's daughter, and Ada, the daughter of old Aaron, are not chosen for the sacrifices, then set me down as a fool." At the mention of these 2 names, a deathly pallor overspread the faces of the 2 friends, and they would have fallen to the floor had not the stout arms of Abner caught them and led them to a seat. Omar had long been the secretly affianced lover of Tamar, while Gad had plighted his troth to Ada. When the young men recovered from the blow, they wildly jumped up and cried, "No, no, that must not be. They are ours, and they must be rescued at all hazards. You, friend Isaac, and you, good Abner, must help us. By our friendship, by all that you hold sacred, we adjure you, stand by us." But Abner sadly shook his head. "It would avail you nothing," he said. "The fate of the 2 poor girls is sealed, and you cannot alter it. In stratagem and cunning, we are no match for the priests, and to attempt to force will only subject you to ridicule, if indeed the enraged people who regard their priests as demigods should not tear you to pieces. No, I love and respect you, although you are not believers, but this thing cannot be altered." And thereupon he strode out of the house back to the temple, even leaving the refreshments his father had prepared for him untouched, for he could not bear the despairing looks of the friends. When he had gone, the 2 young men turned to old Isaac and so desponding with their looks, so prayerful the tones in which they besought the old man to lend them his cooperation, that he could not resist. And after considering for some time, the father of Abner told them that he had formed a plan by which they might possibly gain their object. But he added, "It is a bold game. You will have to play, and the consequences may be terrible for yourself if the plan fail." Excuse me, y'all. Yet it is the only thing that can be done, the only thing that promises the shadow of success. Of course, the friends were willing to do anything. What was life to them if the two maidens were taken away from them forever? And so they told old Isaac, and then the latter disclosed his plan. But what that was, how it was executed, and whether it had the desired result, the sequel must show. In the meantime, the fourth hour had come, and the inhabitants, the king and the queen and their friends and followers included, had reassembled in the temple, all curious to know how the drawing of the lots would terminate, all eager to witness the end of the ceremonies. And now, one after the other, the 20 priests strolled in and went to the altar, while at the same time the 6 virgins were led forward and made to kneel around it. 6 strips of parchment, each with the name of one of the virgins written upon it, were put into a vase, while 6 beans, of which 4 were white and 2 were black, were put into another. Simultaneously with one of the pieces of parchment, a bean was to be drawn, and the virgin whose name appeared upon the strip was led to be free. If the bean were white, but to be declared worthy for the sacrifice, if the color of the bean were black. The 2 youngest of the priests were blindfolded, and then after the 2 vessels had been well shaken by the high priest, the dreadful lottery commenced under the supervision of the last named functionary. Every breath was hushed in the vast assembly, while all eyes were turned upon the face of the high priest in silent expectation. And now the arms of the blindfolded drawers were raised. In one hand appeared a strip of parchment paper, while the other exhibited a beam of dazzling whiteness. With a slow movement, the high priest stretched out his arm to take the parchment, and after deliberately unrolling it, he read it in a monotonous tone of voice, the name of Rebecca. A shout went up from the assembled multitude, for Rebecca was free, and the people rejoiced, forgetting for the moment that the remaining 5, there were 2 whose doom was irrevocably sealed. She who bore that name, which had just been uttered by more than 1,000 tongues, had fallen down and fainted. The emotions of her heart had been too much for her, and while the people rejoiced at her good fortune, she lay in utter oblivion. But at a nod of the high priest, 4 stout young men came forward. The form of the insensible maiden was raised and borne out of the temple, while the arms of the 2 blinded priests again descended. Again a piece of parchment and a white beam were drawn, and this time the high priest in a monotonous voice pronounced the name of the virgin, pronounced the name of Dinah, another of the 6 virgins. Again the people rejoiced, and again the liberated maiden fell down and fainted, and she too was taken up and carried out of the temple. Then the drawing of the lots was resumed for the 3rd time, and resulted as the 2 preceding ones. The name that was now pronounced by the high priest being that Keturah, who when she heard that she was free also fainted from the excess of her emotions, and was also carried away. Now there remained only 1 white beam, only 1 single chance for the 3 remaining victims. Nahum, Hermon, and Aaron had become fearfully excited. Their children stood on the brink of a terrible abyss, and no earthly power seemed to be able to prevent their falling down. The three maidens sat motionless, erect as so many statues cut out of stone, not a sign, not a breath indicating that there was yet life in their motionless forms. And now the blindfolded priests once more put their hands into the vase and slowly deliberated. The two arms went up, and the last white beam glittered in the air. Solemnly, the high priest lifted his arm to take parchment slowly, and it unrolled, and in deep tones the name Zilpah sounded from the lips of the old villain. The liberated virgin lay fainting at the foot of the altar, but no rejoicing shout went up from the multitude, and all eyes were directed to the spot where the king, the queen, and Aaron, the king's officer, lay on the floor, broken down and senseless. The blow had fallen on them like a thunderbolt, and the lightning's flash had prostrated them where they stood. Tamai and Ada had not fallen down. The blow had been too hard, excuse me, and it had taken away their reason. Haya had taken compassion on the suffering innocents, and in his mercy had spared them their consciousness of their terrible and hopeless situation. For the moment, all was confusion in the temple, and the people began to think that the end of the ceremonies would be postponed. But in this they were mistaken. The priests were too eager to clutch their prey, which they felt sure they could easily restore to reason and consciousness. In a little while, Nahum, Hermon, and Aaron were lifted up and restored to life, whereupon they were put on chairs that had been brought forward for the purpose. Then the two stoutest priests came forward to the still kneeling victims and raised them on their feet. The poor girls had been bereft of reason, as we have seen above, and therefore they offered no objection to the doings of the villains. They did not even shudder at the indelicate touches, but like machines they allowed their movements to be directed at the will of their taskmasters. And now they were to be unveiled, they were to be divested of their clothing, for in a state of entire nudity they were to take their final farewell of their parents, friends, and assembled multitude. Already the hands of the priests were stretched out to tear down the veils which hid the features of the two virgins, but the next moment the two villains recoiled and fell down on the floor. A flash, oh wow, man, hold on, y'all. A flash of lightning so intensely vivid that for the moment the temple was illuminated to its farthest corners, and as if the noonday sun had descended from his spear and come into the building, had suddenly shot right into the faces of the two rascals, and besides prostrating them at their feet of their companions, it at the same time revived the reason of the two maidens, who now stood quite conscious again, but silent and awe-stricken like the rest of the assembled multitude. Immediately after the flash of lightning there came a crash of thunder, as if 10,000 cannon had been fired in one simultaneous discharge, and now the heavens grew black as Erebus. Flash followed on flash, while the thunder crashed in one continuous roar. Then came a flash more vivid than all the rest, followed by a peal of thunder that made the very earth tremble and shook the temple to its foundation. And a moment later, a bright flame shot up in front of the edifice and illuminated the interior. The lightning had struck one of the ancient trees that stood near the door and set it on fire. At the same time, the portals of the temple were thrown open, and in came two persons dressed in snow-white garments. The first of these persons, an old man with a bald head and long flowing beard, whose features closely resembled the features of old Mordecai, strode boldly forward, followed by his companion, whose fair face and light, airy form gave him the appearance of an angel of the Lord. The two seemingly supernatural beings went straight to the altar of Moloch, while the terrified priest timidly drew on one side. And then the visitors raised the white sticks they bore in their hands and broke the image of the idol into 10,000 pieces. Then they turned to the maidens, whose hands they took, as if to assure them their protection, and now they confronted the villainous and cowardly priests of Moloch. "Villains," said the elder of the two, "dastardly, cowardly villains, your licentiousness, your inequity has at last reached up to the throne of Hiah, the true God of Israel. We have been sent to put a stop to your wicked and sinful career. Look upon these innocent maidens whom in your villainy you had selected for a fate worse than 10,000 deaths, whom you had selected to minister to your beastly lusts, to satisfy your hellish desires, while you made your poor deluded followers believe that they were to be sacrificed to that miserable idol, the broken pieces of which are crumbling under my feet. Begone, you rascals, pollute no longer the temple of Hiah with your presence." And with this, he and his companion again raised their sticks, but the priest did not await on the onset. As if driven by 10,000 demons, they jumped up and fled out the temple, and they did not rest until they reached a small house near the outskirts of the city, where the underground apartments for the reception of their victims were dug. The pretended heavenly messengers had meanwhile turned to the assembled people, and in a solemn voice, who bore the resemblance of Mordecai, said, "Men of Israel, deeply have ye offended the great Hiah, him who in his infinite goodness and mercy led us safely out of the land of our oppressors, over the boundless waters, to this glorious country where you might have prospered, where you might have prayed to him in his own temple. But you have turned away from the God of your fathers. The temple you erected to him you have desecrated. You have turned it into a temple of Moloch, the imaginary heathenish deity, whose image lies broken beneath my feet, and who has not even the power to punish its destroyer. Your priests are hypocrites and impostors, and you stand on the brink of a fearful abyss. Woe unto you if ye do not return to the only true God of Israel. Your city shall be destroyed, and you shall be swept from the face of the earth if you do not leave your evil ways. Go to your homes now and reflect on what you have seen and heard. But these maidens will remain with us. You have forfeited all claims to them, yet no harm will befall them. And if you indeed return to the God of Israel, they will be restored to you in their purity and innocence, whereas otherwise you will never see them again." Now the mysterious visitors ceased, and one after the other the people left the temple, marveling at what they had seen and heard. Nahum, Hermon, and Aaron indeed made an attempt to join their children, but an emperor's gesture of the two messengers drove them back, and at last they too left the temple to seek their homes. When the last of the lingerers had disappeared, the pretended ghosts tore off their disguise and revealed to the gaze of the astonished maidens the well-known and beloved forms and features of Omar and Gad. When Abner had left his father's house, some 3 or 4 hours before, the two friends had implored old Isaac to help them in rescuing the doomed virgins, in terms so supplicating and earnest that the old man could not withstand, and he had formed a plan whereby the young men might possibly gain their object, as we have seen above. The father of Abner knew, as well as his son, that any ordinary stratagem, any ordinary cunning would be of no avail against the superior craft of the priests of Moloch, and so he came to the conclusion that only by working upon the superstition of the people was anything to be gained against the wishes and the will of the priest. The old man had of course retained a perfect recollection of the outward appearance of old Mordecai, and so when Omar and Gad had declared their willingness to do and dare to do anything to liberate the two imperiled maidens, he, with the aid of a wig and a false beard, disguised Omar the stoutest of the two, so well that anyone who saw him might easily have taken him for the deceased liberator of the Israelites. Gad, whose light and every form fitted him exactly for the purpose, he was made to resemble an angel of the Lord. Then the two friends provided themselves with white garments and sticks of the same color, and after they had been instructed by old Isaac how to proceed and what to say, they wrapped themselves in large cloaks and sallied forth to the temple. What, however, the result of their undertaking would have been under any ordinary circumstances is doubtful, but long before they reached the temple, the storm that had been gathering since noon, and the first fury of which had prostrated the two priests in the temple, burst upon them. Yet so eager they were to arrive in time for the rescue of Tamar and Ada that they did not heed the pouring rain, and scarcely had they reached the entrance to the temple and thrown their cloaks at the front door, one of the old trees that stood near, when a flash of lightning struck that very tree and set it, as well as the cloaks, on fire. When a thunderclap came, they pushed open the door and strode in boldly. What followed we have already seen, and now we return to the rescuers and the rescued. The lovers had already informed their sweethearts of what we know concerning themselves and their plan, and now they were deliberating on the course they were to pursue. Here Omar said, "We cannot stay, while for you, Tamar and Ada, it will be equally dangerous to return to your home. For although the people have been terribly frightened today, tomorrow these villainous priests of Moloch will be reinstated in full power, and believe me, they will soon return to the attempt to get you in their possession. No, in flight only lies your safety. Perhaps in a time our friends may return to the God of their fathers, and then we may return to them. But if that should not be the case, Higher, who has helped and protected us thus far, will help and protect us still further. At the distance of about a league from this city, there is a cave which I accidentally discovered while out hunting one day, and as night is fast in approach, we can easily leave the temple and proceed to that shelter under the cover of darkness. And while you remain there, under the protection of Gad, I shall return to secure and bring away such of your and my own clothing and other property as we may want, a task by no means difficult for me, as I have free and easy access to the households, as well as Nahum, as of Aaron and Korah. I then shall return to you, and we will stay in the cave as long as we can do so with security, while the game and the fruit that abound in that vicinity will not let us want for the necessities of life. To follow this advice, Gad and the maiden saw was the best thing they could do to Gad and the maiden saw was the best thing they could do under existing circumstances. And as night had by this time fairly set in, they all resolved to depart instantly. The two young men had retained their own clothing when they were disguised by old Isaac, and all they had to do, therefore, was to throw off their white garments and tie them together with their false wigs and the beard of Omar into a bundle. The two priests who had been prostrated by the lightning lay stiff and stark where they had fallen, and Omar had contrived to take off their upper garments unperceived by the maidens. He now wrapped the latter to protect them against the chill night air and to hide the snowy color of their dresses. In these ample and dark-hued cloaks, the four sallied forth into the street. They met no obstacle in leaving the city, and under the guidance of Omar, who knew his road, they soon reached the cavern. This proved to be a large and airy natural vault, And after gathering the dry leaves and moss that lay around in abundance, so as to form a soft and comfortable resting place, the maidens lay down, and soon their eyes were closed in sweet repose. Gad then sat down near the entrance, while Omar returned to the city. Here that young man found not the least difficulty. In the king's palace, which he visited first, all was consternation and utter perplexity, and nobody questioned, or indeed even perceived him. When he went straight to Tamar's room, unperceived, he packed up whatever he thought worth taking, and just as unperceived he left the dwelling of Nahum to repair to his father's house, where he deposited his burden. The same confusion and perplexity existed in the dwelling of Aaron, where he succeeded in securing of Ada's wardrobe and other property as much as he could carry. Gad's parents had gone out to visit and condole with the afflicted Aaron, while the domestics of the household had also left the dwelling to gossip with their cronies over the events of the day. Here Omar might have carried away all the house contained, but he contented himself with carrying off nearly all that his friend called his own. He then returned to his own dwelling, but his parents had gone to the king's palace, and therefore Omar had it here all his own way. First, he packed up as much of his wardrobe and other things he wanted to take with him. Then he tied all the bundles together and went to the stable, where he found his own horse that had been caught and tamed for him. He put the bundles on the animal's back and then went into the kitchen, whence he soon emerged with a considerable bundle of provisions. This he also put on his horse's back, and at last he carefully and deliberately led his beast out into the street, and without hindrance or accident soon was out of the city. About 3 hours after his departure, the young man had again reached the cavern, where he found Gad still awake, sitting near the entrance. And now the two friends carried into the vault the goods Omar had brought out of the city, leaving the horse to feed in the luxuriant grass that grew around that spot. After this, the two young men partook of a hearty supper, and at last they also lay down and soon fell asleep. Y'all, that was a lot. That was the death of Mordecai and separation. I am lost. According to this, I'm on chapter 12. And I was only going to do 10. So you got 10 and 11. And we'll pick up at 12 on another occasion. Peace and blessings.